Okay, so today we're looking at the foundations of America. Okay, this is our first unit. This will be the first lecture in our first unit, and so we are going to dive in. Um, the first thing we're going to take a look at is this idea, this concept of a new world, and I put "new" in quotation marks because, again, we know that there were people living here, and we're going to look at that in a second, but something to keep in mind is that throughout history, how we name things is very important. The people who came up with the names are usually the people who won or the people telling the story. And so when you see new there, it's new to the Europeans that are coming here and, again, in air quotes, discovering this land. But the reality is that it's not new. There have been people living here. This is their home, right? And so, in fact, we know that in the Americas, right? So in North America, Central America, and South America, before the Europeans arrived, we know that there were there were about 2,000 people groups and cultures, 90 to 100 million people living here, 2 to 8 million in North America alone. We know that they largely functioned as clans that were matrilineal, right? Meaning that the power in the family followed the mother's bloodline, right? Europeans are very patriarchal or patrilineal, meaning that the power in the family tends to follow the male bloodline, right, or the father's bloodline. These societies, these cultures that we know of that were in the Americas were largely matrilineal. So that right there is already going to be a cause for tension when the Europeans arrive. Um, and so why did the Europeans come? Why are they coming to this land? There's already people here. Why are they coming in the first place? So first of all, we know that European exploration happened for the three G's. Hopefully you remember this from world history. But God, glory, and gold, again, they set out to discover new lands. They set out to tame the unknown in the name of God, right? Going out to spread their religion, for glory, to bring honor and glory to their kingdoms and to themselves, and then also for gold. They were going for new markets. They were looking for new sources of money and revenue and riches. And so in 1492, as the little nursery rhyme goes, right, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he was aiming for the Indies, or, India, and he landed in the Bahamas. But he didn't know that. He didn't realize that he wasn't in the Indies, as he called them. And so when he met people here, he started calling them Los Indios, right? The people of the Indies, right? Los Indios, or as we would translate into English, Indians, which is where we can have the name, right, for what we have referred to Native Americans as in the past, Indians, right? And that word is no longer acceptable because we recognize, first of all, the error, right? So he wasn't actually in the Indies. These people aren't people of the Indies. But secondly, it's become a pejorative term, not a nice name for Native Americans, right? So instead, we would say that they are indigenous. The word indigenous means that they are, native to that place, or we can just say Native Americans, right? But he thinks he's discovered these places, and then he sets up trade, right? And this Columbian exchange becomes his legacy, right? This is probably the only reason we still care about Columbus, right? The man set out on a voyage to go one place, didn't actually make it there, but we celebrate his voyage, if celebrate is even the right word, primarily because of the organization and trade he set up, right? Sending food and technology to the new world, or from the new world back to the old world, bringing old world technology and food to the new world, again, new in quotation marks. But the other side of this is he also brought with him plenty of disease. Amongst them, typhus, malaria, whooping cough, diphtheria, and syphilis as well. I mean, the world would never be the same, right? Foods that we have here in the Americas that they didn't have in Europe, they got things like the potato and tomato and corn. European crops like bananas and grapes came to the Americas, and eventually those types of products became major components of the economies of countries here in the Americas, and it changed the face of the Americas entirely. But then why do we call them the Americas and not why do we not live in the United States of Colombia, right? Or of Columbus even, right? Um, and that just all has to do with, again, to the victor go the spoils. Uh, Columbus made it to the Bahamas, eventually making his way into the mainland. But this Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, is credited with being the first one to make it to the mainland, right? Which is why these are the Americas. We ignore the fact that that Leif Erikson and his crew made it up to the northern parts of like Canada, Nova Scotia, prior to this. But again, it's all about who has power. That's where names come from. So eventually, we know that our country is founded by or founded and rooted in English colonies. So why did the English join exploration? Again, very similar reasons to the rest of the Europeans, the Spanish and the Portuguese. They had religious, economic, and social motivations. The religious motivations, um, there were Protestant groups that were having issues. They were kind of starting to break away from the Church of England, right? The Anglican Church, which if you don't remember from your world history classes, the the English used to be Catholic, and then Henry VIII wanted a divorce and so many other things, and so he decided to uh, leave the Catholic Church, take England, and make the Anglican Church, which is essentially the Catholic Church. They're very similar, but instead of the Pope being the head of the Anglican Church, the King or Queen is the head of the Anglican Church. So there were groups in England that would be considered Protestant. They were Anglican, but they started having their own ideas, and they started breaking away from the tradition. They were known as Puritans, and there were other groups, Quakers and such, that were seeking out some religious freedom, right? And just as much as they wanted their freedom, oftentimes the king wanted them gone. And so a lot of them were allowed to leave, were not necessarily forced out, but when they said, "Hey, we want to go to the New World," they weren't necessarily stopped. Nobody said, "No, please don't go." So they came and they settled colonies here. That would be groups like the Pilgrims, the Puritans, right? The Quakers in Pennsylvania. They had economic motivation. So just like the other explorers, the English were looking for new ways, new sources of revenue, right? New markets that they could tap. And they figured if they could start those colonies, they could start using the resources of the land there. And then they had social motivations. Again, there were people. To own land was a big deal. To be a landowner gave you voting rights, gave you property value, but it elevated your status. And so there were plenty of men in England who were looking for a leg up. They wanted to elevate their status. They wanted to make it in society, and they knew that they weren't going to get land staying in England, so they decided to risk it, come to this new world, and stake their claim and become landowners here, right, for that social mobility. We know that they started coming around 1585. We get a lost colony, what we refer to as a lost colony, right? So we know of the 13, the Carolinas, North and South, Georgia, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. We know about those. New York being taken from the Dutch, not an original English settlement, but they get it from the Dutch. But the one we forget about, there is a lost colony, Roanoke Island, right? And that one's around 1585. It goes under. The people more than likely died of starvation and disease, and they were never heard from again. Okay, so between 1585 and 1732, the English start or take over 13 colonies. Okay, and those are the 13 colonies you're most familiar with. You should have covered them in 8th grade. And a lot of these colonies, there are similarities between them by region, right? So you studied, and you should be reading about in the textbook, the New England colonies and the middle colonies and the southern colonies. And by region, so the southern colonies all had pretty similar economies. They were largely agrarian. They grew crops. The New England colonies, mostly their main income would have been from shipbuilding and factor and fishing. Excuse me. Um, so by region, they had some things in common, but for the most part, they all stood pretty unique, and they were independent. The colonies were independent. They were almost like their own little countries here on the east coast of what is now the United States. They were all still part of England. They all still belonged to England. They had English governors, but they weren't really working together. Okay, they're pretty separate, which is key, because in order to have the revolution, they have to come together. They have to band together to fight against England, and that is going to be a major topic for them as they start this process of will they actually work together. Okay. At the same time, that this is happening, over in Europe, there's a scientific revolution that has just ended, if you will. It never really ends, right? We keep making scientific discoveries even to today. But the scientific revolution kind of comes to an end, if you will. It slows down in 1687 when Newton publishes the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Okay, but the ideas of using logic and reason that were started in the scientific revolution, they continue into this period known as the Enlightenment. And we typically date the Enlightenment from 1715 to 1789. You should have learned about it in world history, so this is going to be a brief overview. But again, in the wake of the scientific revolution, scholars and philosophers are reevaluating their old ideas about government, religion, economics, and education. And it spurs this enlightenment, a new intellectual movement that stresses reason and thought and the power of individuals to solve problems. It's known as the Age of Reason. For the first time in history, people are being encouraged and allowed to question things like their king, like the church, right? Prior to this, if the Pope said, you did, right? If the king said, you did. You didn't question it. And for the first time, people are being encouraged to ask questions, to use logic, to find evidence to support things. And that's going to create a lot of tension between the lower classes of society and the nobility, because now the common people are asking questions, and the nobility doesn't always have answers, and in fact rarely has answers that are satisfying. Out of the Enlightenment are going to come these 5 thinkers. There are more than these, right? There's women like Mary Wollstonecraft. There are other philosophers and leaders. These are the 5 we are most concerned with in American history. You covered all of them in world history as well. In U.S. history, we're concerned with these 5 because a lot of their ideas become the building blocks for our country. Okay? I'm going to say this several times, and I say it for emphasis, but you have to understand, we did not create democracy. We did not create any of the concepts that we built our country upon. We took them from thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu. We took their ideas, and we're just the first. We didn't create any of it. We're just the first ones to put them all in one place. We're the first ones to make this great experiment that is the United States based on these ideas, okay? So John Locke talked a lot about self-government, government by the people, right? He said that people are endowed with these natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Hopefully that phrase sounds familiar to you, but maybe you're sitting there thinking, wait, that's not how I've heard it. That's because eventually the writers of the Declaration of Independence, the writers of the Constitution, and other founding documents will usually say it as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because again, property has a lot of power. Property ownership brings power. It means you have a vote. It means you have a voice. And we weren't really comfortable with everyone having a voice. We'll talk about that when we get further into the Constitution and whatnot. But the reality is that the Founding Fathers didn't trust everybody. They didn't want everybody having a say from the get-go, and thus they changed this idea. John Locke said life, liberty, and property, and instead the founding fathers here said, we're going to tweak it a little bit. We're going to make that the pursuit of happiness, right? So they're not guaranteed, they're not promised property, but they are promised the right to pursue their happiness. The last thing Locke gives us is this idea of the consent of the governed, right? That the government exists because the people allow it to. They give their permission or their consent to be governed. That the people at any time can remove that consent. That they can say, no, we do not give you permission. Voltaire there, I realize his name is missing, I'm sorry. Voltaire's the second one there. He wrote satire. So think of Saturday Night Live or Mad TV, except he wrote it down, right? And he wrote these satirical essays that were basically large metaphors, big stories that were meant to poke holes and point out the issues of the time. And he fought very, very hard for tolerance, for reason, for freedom of religious belief and freedom of speech. One of the famous things Voltaire is known for saying is, I do not agree with a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. This is where we get our idea of freedom of speech. We've written that into our Constitution, the First Amendment, right? This idea that you have the freedom to say and believe what you choose, right? And again, but Voltaire wants tolerance, right? He fights for this idea that we don't have to agree. I could disagree with everything you say, but it is your right to say it, right? Montesquieu gives us the idea of separation of powers, that there should be a division among government branches, that we shouldn't have just one king in charge of everything, but that there should be the makers of the law, those that carry out the law, and then those that judge the law, right? And that's where we get our division of powers, as well as these checks and balances, that those separate powers, those separate branches of government should have the ability to check the power, right? Power should be a check to power. The executive has the ability to check the power of the legislature. The legislature can check the power of the courts and whatnot. Rousseau was a firm believer in direct democracy, which we do not have. We'll talk more about that when we look at the Constitution. But again, he reestablishes this idea of a social contract, that people are coming together, like Locke said, this idea of the consent of the governed, right, and self-government, government by the people. Rousseau says that people are coming together, they're agreeing to give up their individual freedoms in favor of the common good, that when they form a government to protect their common good. But in order to have a government, you have to give up some of your rights. And again, that idea of consent of the governed. This last one, Beccaria. Beccaria is largely responsible for being the father of our modern legal system. The idea that those accused of a crime should have a speedy trial, that their punishment should fit the crime, it should not be excessive, right? This idea that laws are intended so that the government seeks the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? Laws are not meant to just should not be meant to benefit just the few, right? He also advocated an end to capital punishment or the death penalty. We didn't listen to all of his ideas, but we listened to a lot of them, and he is very important. So some democratic ideas from this movement. Hopefully you saw them as we went, but these are going to be some key ideas to our democracy in the United States. So this idea of natural rights really stood out to the founders, that men are born equal and rights cannot be taken away. And I put men there because that is what the founders believed, right? So again, we don't have to agree with what the founders believed in, right? I don't believe that men are the only ones born with equal rights. I think men and women are born with equal rights. All human beings have equal rights that cannot be taken away. The reason it says men is because the founders of this country, at the time, it was their thinking that men were born with equal rights. They weren't concerned with women. They weren't concerned with children or so on. They were concerned with men. So again, I'm not making this statement that only men are born equal. But these are the ideas from the founders' time based on the Enlightenment. Okay. The other one is individual rights, the rights of freedom of speech, life, liberty, and again, our founding fathers are going to say the pursuit of happiness, not property. The third thing is limited government. Government is not all powerful. It goes along with self-government, that there needs to be a separation of powers and checks and balances to restrict the power of the government. In other words, we like to say in this country that we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? The counter to that would be a government, if we're talking about monarchies, right? And this idea, hopefully in world history, you learned about the divine right to rule, right? Kings often, to solidify their power, kings would often say that they had a divine right to rule, that God had chosen them to be king. And so, if our democracy is a government of the people, then a monarchy is a government of God. If ours is a government by the people, then theirs is a government by the king. And if ours is a government for the people, theirs is a government for God and king, or king and country, if you will, right? So all of the power resides in the monarchy, in the monarch, in the king, and thereby God, because God is the one giving him the divine right to rule, right? That is the belief in monarchies oftentimes. We are saying instead, at the founding of this country, that we believe that the government exists because the people choose to make it happen, that it is intended to be run by the people, and that it is for the people. Okay, it is meant to protect them and be for them. Those are the ideas that start coming out of the Enlightenment, right? And so as the colonies are coming into effect, they're being built and they're coming up and they're growing. Then the Enlightenment comes and these ideas start making their way across the Atlantic Ocean, and the colonists begin to read these writings, and they begin to question the current political system. They begin to question this idea of the British monarchy and the British government having control over them. And they begin to develop their own ideals. These ideas that why should a king across the Atlantic Ocean have the ability to tell me what to do? Why should the king be the one that's in charge? They had a governor in the colonies, right? An English crown appointed governor. They paid taxes to the crown, but the English Parliament, or the English legislature, the equivalent of our legislative branch, was in England. And the colonies did not have representation there. They did not have representatives in the Parliament. But they were paying taxes for it, and they were giving their money to the king. And so they began to ask these questions of, why are we doing this, right? Again, this is the political system of the colonies, right? The king is at the top. The nobility is still in the middle. And that looks like the governors, right? So they had governors of their colonies, but then the majority of the people are commoners. They're just these colonists, and they begin to question whether or not this current system with the king on top is actually what they want and what's best for them. Then there's a whole other layer. So the Enlightenment is really a secular movement. Secular meaning non-religious, right? It's using science and reason to ask these questions and to make these claims. Then comes the Great Awakening, and the Great Awakening is an attempt to increase the declining membership and dedication to the Puritan Church. So in the colonies, while they're here, the colonies exist for quite some time, right? Before the Revolution, they are fully in existence. Most people, by the time of the Revolution, most people who are living in the colonies have never even been to England. They've been born here in the Americas, and they've only ever lived their life in the colonies. And so, by this time, church attendance is in decline. People are not wanting to hear what the king has to say anymore. They're not wanting to be part of Anglican religion. And so the Puritan Church, which again, they're not wanting everything that the Anglican Church has. They have their own ideas. They feel like they need to have this awakening. And so they go on, they hold these series of revival meetings led by Jonathan Edwards, again, with the goals of bringing more people back into the church. And the effects, it has a few main effects. One is that it increases church membership. So a lot of people come back to church. It increases the size of organized religion in the colonies. You see the rise and the expansion of groups like the Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists, as well as the Quakers and just Puritans in general. But then the colonists also begin to question this traditional religious authority. So if the Enlightenment awakened the secular side, right, the non-religious side, it asked them to start asking questions about their government and the way that they are governed, and they started to question the role of the king as their political or government leader. The Great Awakening began to make the colonists question the traditional religious authority of the English church and the king, right? So now you have two sides to look at this, right? You have the secular and you have the religious, or the secular and the sacred, right? As some historians would say it. And so it ends up creating a push for the separation of church and state. As these ideas of the Enlightenment start entangling with the Great Awakening, people begin to see a need to separate church and state. That doesn't mean that they don't want religion. Like it says here, the membership of the church increased. More people are going to church, but what they're realizing is that the church doesn't have to be where they get their laws or where they get their authority, right? In England, the king is both the head of the church and the head of their government. And they're beginning to think maybe that shouldn't be how it is. So you have the secular movement of the Enlightenment, you have the sacred or the religious movement of the Great Awakening. Both of those are happening, and people begin to ask questions. Then comes a decision by the English that really begins to set the colonists over the edge, and that comes as at the end of the French and Indian War. This fight for North America. Remember, the English are not the only ones in North America. The Spanish are here. They have a colony in Florida. The French are here. They have colonies all throughout Canada. They have colonies in the Louisiana Territory. So our modern day areas of like the Dakotas and Montana and Minnesota, Iowa and such, right there in the middle of the country, right? They have all this territory over there, and then there's going to be this territory of the Ohio River Valley. So, again, kind of what I've been saying, right? Both the French and the English are here. There's this area. I'll show you a map in a slide or two. And you'll see the Ohio River Valley is this kind of no man's land. The English think it's theirs. They think they have claim to it. The French think it's theirs, and they don't see anybody there. Nobody's living there. And so the French go and they've built Fort Duquesne in this area that the British had given to wealthy Virginia planters, right? So the French don't know about these Virginia planters. These Virginia planters haven't done anything with the land yet, but they find out about this fort being built by the French, and so Virginia ends up sending their militia to evict the French from the area. And this is going to start a war that lasts from 1754 to 1763, okay? The 9 years of war over this territory, that Ohio River Basin. Okay, so where you see the words Appalachian Mountains, those are those little bumps between the Ohio River Basin and the words Appalachian Mountains, right? But that whole east coast is where the English colonies are. The French are located to the west of that Ohio River Basin, so they're further over into like modern day, again, Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa. And that's where the French are, and the Ohio River Basin, smack dab in the middle. They're going to be fighting over this land. The French, very early on, win victories. They're fighting very aggressively, and most are shocked that the British were not. They're shocked at how scared the British were. George Washington is a young 22-year-old soldier fighting for the English. He fights courageously. However, over the course of this war, he has 2 horses shot out from underneath him and killed. He himself has his coat pierced by 4 bullets. He's not having much success. He is not the picture of a modern war hero that we have in our memory. Often we think about the George Washington of the Revolutionary War and the George Washington of our first president. We forget that his early career was not as decorated. The British eventually send William Pitt to help Washington, and the colonists begin to turn the tide of the war. They also get some help from the Iroquois. I'd like to point out, again, this war is called the French and Indian War. Wars are named by the person who wins the war. They are named by the person who wins the war. So the very name French and Indian War should tell you that the English are going to win this war, or at least in their mind, they're going to win the war. And we are descended from English colonies, so this is why we refer to it still today as the French and Indian War. Who were they fighting? They were fighting the French and the Indians, or the Native Americans, right? But Native Americans fought on both sides, as we'll see in a moment. In 1763, the British and the French sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Great Britain ends up claiming Canada and all of North America east of the Mississippi River, except for, again, they still don't have the Louisiana Territory, which we'll look at in a moment. There will be another map in a moment. They also take Florida away from Spain, because Spain decides that they are going to fight with France at one point, and the British are having none of that. But again, this is a peace treaty between the English and the French. Who's missing? Who's the other piece of this war? It's the Native Americans. The Native Americans had a better relationship with the French. The French treated them much better. They let them have their lands. They didn't bother them. The French were in that Louisiana territory. They were in the Canadian territories, but they allowed the Native Americans to maintain their tribal lands, to stay where they were. They didn't bother them. And the French really had a much better relationship with the Native Americans. But now the British won the war, and the Native Americans have to deal with the British. And so there's a group led by Pontiac that go and they attack British forts. They attack 8 of them, and the British respond not too kindly. They give blankets contaminated with smallpox to 2 chiefs during negotiations. They bring them in to negotiate a peace settlement. They give them 2 blankets with smallpox, intended to have them take back to their village. They would get sick, and then that sickness, smallpox, would spread, and it's successful. It's awful. It's deplorable, right? It is biological warfare. It is no different today than if a country were to use biological or chemical weapons to spread fear and to defeat an enemy, right? And so this ends up killing thousands of Native Americans, to the point that they are so tired from fighting and they're weakened by disease that they have no choice really but to negotiate treaties with the British. The British are also trying to avoid further conflicts because they're fighting too many wars. They're fighting wars here in the colonies, they're fighting wars back in Europe, and they just can't afford any more wars. So they come to the negotiating table and they sign the Proclamation of 1763. So remember, the Treaty of Paris of 1763 is what ends the French and Indian War between the British and the French, and then the Proclamation of 1763 is a treaty between the British and the Native Americans. So it prohibits English colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. I'll show you a map again in a moment. And again, it's because Britain couldn't afford a war. But this decision is going to make colonists mad. Why? Let's look at the map. Again, you see all of that yellow territory on the far right-hand side of the map along the coast, right? Those are the colonies. That orange territory and the like cream-colored territory there is all the land that the English gained from the Treaty of Paris of 1763. That's the land they just won in the war. All of that cream land where it says other British territories, that includes East Florida, West Florida, that province of Quebec, right? They just won all of that land. But the Proclamation of 1763 says that they cannot move west or to the left of that red line. They have all of this new land, but they can't move into it. Their colonists are forbidden from crossing that line and settling. If you're a poor farm laborer who's a colonist, you came here with hopes of getting your own land, you couldn't get it right away, you've been working hard for it, and now all of a sudden you fight in the war, you fight in the French and Indian War, you serve your country, you win the war, and now you think you've got all this territory, and it's finally going to be your turn. You're finally going to move your family west. You're going to settle a claim. You're going to have land. You're going to be a land-owning, property-owning citizen of Britain. only to find out that your government won't let you move, right? And again, a government that's across the ocean, far away, not representing you, that you're already upset with. So now you have the Enlightenment, you have the Great Awakening, which both are causing the people to already question the government, and now you have this settlement, this proclamation of 1763, which is going to be one of the last nails in the coffin of the relationship between the colonies, and England. That's it for this one. Do me a favor, in your notes, write yourself a 5-sentence summary, um, and make sure you have that in your notes before you turn those in on the test day. And we will pick this up, starting with looking at the Revolution and the early Republic in our next meeting. Thank you so much.